Welcome to the CEC Report, the weekly update on the Citizens Electoral Council's fight to save Australia from economic collapse. It's June 3rd. I'm Robert Barwick, and I'm joined tonight by CEC founder and leader Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Thanks, Robbie.
All right. In today's report, we're going to discuss the wheels come off the world's best economy, the Nazi history of the carbon tax promoters, and finally, the CEC forces the food bowl exterminators into retreat, but the war is not won. So first, the wheels come off the world's best economy. Official statistics this week caught up with what most Australians have been experiencing for years. That is, that Australia in reality is in an economic collapse. What the statistics show is that Australia has suffered its single biggest economic contraction for one quarter for more than 20 years. The last time we suffered a decline this big was in the recession we had to have of Paul Keating. It was a 1.2% decline in GDP in one quarter. Now, this event for Australia coincides with increasing economic and financial turmoil around the world, which has probably not been lost on anyone. You got markets crashing, stock markets crashing, debt panic in Europe breaking out again over countries like Greece, etc. As we discussed last week, you have a furious brawl broken out in the corridors of power among world central bankers, etc., over whether to bail out the financial system or not. And it's a brawl that claimed the career of Dominic Strauss-Kahn, the former president of the International Monetary Fund. In terms of market crashes, we've seen the biggest market crashes this week for almost a year. Australia's market yesterday, stock market, lost $30 billion in one day, wiping a lot of money off this year's returns for superannuation funds, etc. Now, in terms of the GDP collapse though, contraction, it's very important. Do not blame the flood. That's what all the experts are blaming. All the flood did is show up the problem. The ironic thing about the flood disaster is that the reconstruction it required afterwards should have boosted GDP. The problem was many Queensland coal mines have been knocked out of production for months because of the flood, and therein lies the problem in Australia. This reality highlights just how dependent Australia is on revenue from raw materials exports to China. And there's a bigger problem associated with that. We're in a dangerous situation as a consequence, because that means our economy is floods aside, our economy is completely dependent upon China. That may seem fine to most people, but what you've got to understand is China's economy, in turn, is completely dependent upon the United States, consumers in the United States. And the United States is a sick, bankrupt economy, and it's the bankruptcy of the United States which is like a sword of Damocles hanging over the head of the world economy at the moment. So that's the situation Australia finds itself in. Craig, Quarry Australia Incorporated is in trouble.
Surely is.
What can be done about it?
Well, Robbie, there's quite a lot can be done about it, but I think we have to start off by recognising that we've had two generations of Australians, in fact people around the world, that have no idea about what a real economy looks like. And they tend to accept this idea of just digging minerals out of the ground and flogging them off as creating real wealth, or it doesn't. That's the problem. We've seen this before in places like Africa for centuries, where they're completely underdeveloped. You have very large numbers of very poor people, and the infrastructure consists, particularly in the British Empire, of railway systems simply going from the mine to the port. And it's rather ironical in Australia that that's where the emphasis these days is on building railway, particularly in Queensland, from the coal mines to the port.
And you can see maps of Africa to this day that have the same telltale mines to ports on rails.
So what you have what you have today is a massive speculative economy where everything is governed by a monetarist system where the value of money itself is what is seen as wealth, which is absolute rubbish. So the best way to look at this is through a device that Mr. Lyndon LaRouche developed himself in 1994 called the triple curve function, because it defines the nature of our economy the way it actually is right now. It's pretty sick, but if you have a look at his curve, which I have an example of here, you have three different lines on his triple curve. The first one is the red line, which is called the financial aggregates, and these are made up of all the different financial instruments that you have in your economy, things like derivatives, mortgages, all those sorts of financial instruments, right? Then you have the green line, which is monetary aggregates, and this is literally what money is in the system, the printing of money in particular in recent periods, but the monetary supply. And then you have, and this is where the monetary system comes in, because it's a creation of credit out of thin air by the banking system and all these sorts of things, which we've seen explode in recent periods. And then you have the blue line, which is the most important, which is physical economic input, outputs, or activity in the economy. And you can see from the interaction of these lines, various things have happened. Like, for example, the lines were going along pretty flat for quite some time, and then all of a sudden they started to either shoot up hyperbolically, that means they go straight up, or in the case of the physical economic curve, the blue line, go through the floor. And that's the one that we're really concerned about, is the one that's going through the floor. But if you look at the curves, you see the financial aggregates and the monetary aggregates crossed over in the year 2000. Well, that's when we had all the massive disruptions with the Asian financial crisis, and we had all sorts of problems, and the solution to that then was to turn the printing presses on, start printing money, particularly in the US, print money to solve the problem.
Following the repeal of Glass-Steagall.
1999 was a repeal of Glass-Steagall, so consequently you had the turning of the printing press, a complete deregulation of the entire process. They had another hiccup, which was, of course, a major hiccup, which was the 2007 global financial crisis that Mr. LaRouche actually forecast. And this is when the entire economy blew apart, and it was seen that these global derivatives instruments, these collateralized debt obligations, were actually worthless. It was the speculative paper debt was worthless. And so consequently, you see the financial aggregates, the red line, start to dip down. So what you have is interaction of all these three curves, but the most important thing is the bottom curve, the physical economic curve, the actual real production that sustains us as a community, as people, is being looted blind. Because you have companies coming in, buying up productive activities, whether it be farming or manufacturing, flogging off the most important parts of that in order to feed the speculative bubble on the top. Now, most people don't fully understand what is involved in an economy, and that's where the problem starts with, because what Mr. LaRouche says, and this is quite stunning, is that 50% of your economy should be involved in that is, 50% of the total economic activity of your economy should be involved in basic economic infrastructure. And again, people don't know what that is, right? Well, basic economic infrastructure is made up of physical infrastructure, for example, water management, water development, like large-scale dams, canals, irrigation systems, water purification, desalination. It's made up of transportation systems, which we in our country are really short of, like high-speed rail systems. It's made up of power production. We're predominantly dependent in this country on coal and gas. We need, for example, nuclear power, and also the distribution systems, whether that be nuclear power stations, when we promote the idea of the modular high-temperature gas-cooled reactors. It also involves sanitation, which is not necessarily something that people think about, but how the development of sanitation for cities is a big deal. It also involves communication systems, and we've heard a lot of one-sided discussion about the national broadband. But in context, if you only have a communication system with nothing else, it's a waste of time. You also have things like essential services, like general education, for the development of in forms of classical education, but to bring up your citizens, educate your citizens. You have healthcare, another aspect. You also have the development of science and technology to actually promote the development of your economy. So all of these aspects of basic economic infrastructure feed the capacity for people to develop productive industries, to produce things, right? Now, that means that when you look at how an economy should work, you should only have two curves. And the first of those curves, of course, is a physical curve for the physical production of goods, and the second is simply for financial instruments to cover the shifting around of the means of exchange of those two things.
Yeah, financial instruments that are related to the physical activity, only the physical activity.
Yeah. So you don't have a monetary curve, because your monetary system in a healthy economy has to be governed by what we in the CEC refer to as national banking.
But how could the world possibly survive not having credit default swaps?
Well, simply if you have, as Mr. LaRouche has proposed, a global Glass-Steagall with each country having its own national banking system, its own internal credit creation system, as was proposed, or was, President Franklin Roosevelt was moving in that direction before he unfortunately died, then you don't need to have these so-called insurance instruments for the wild exchange rate fluctuations that you tend to have, and the gambling problems.
And what's interesting about what you're saying there with the monetary thing, when Australia just exports, we have a lot of resources, but we're just exporting them. China uses them for a physical purpose. To us, they're just a monetary injection into our economy. And ironically, a state like Western Australia, which is the big boom state, which hasn't had a flood, is in recession despite being the boom state, because this is not any way to have a functional economy.
No, and the big problems you have in Western Australia is the fly-in, fly-out economy, where instead of investing in local basic economic infrastructure in the northwest, you have people simply flown in and flown in and flown out, and the local towns are literally dying, and that's the problem. So the focus has to be on basic economic infrastructure across the board to stimulate real physical economic activity, and that can't just be in one sector, in mining. And if you measure it, only the mining sector is increasing. Every other sector of our economy is collapsing. So that's how we have to change it. Focus on the entire economy and change it from that point of view.
And viewers can, if you haven't already read it, get yourself a copy from our website of our book, What Australia Must Do to Survive the Depression, which goes through this triple curve and goes through the CEC's economic solutions. So coming up after the break, we're going to discuss the Nazi history of the carbon tax promoters. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Let's talk now about the Nazi history of Australia's carbon tax promoters. So we saw a big flap this week in Australian politics over this carbon tax ad fronted by Kate Blanchett. There's always a lot of hysteria in Australian media at certain times, and you know there's something else going on. This one was a definite smokescreen. Far more important than who was in front of the ad is who is behind it, because the grouping of forces behind this ad is very disturbing. So this ad was put together by a group calling itself Say Yes Australia, i.e., everyone say yes to a carbon tax. But of course, what sort of group is that? It is a front, and it's a front for a number of groups. I'll just name them. The Australian Conservation Foundation, Prince Philip's organisation, Prince Philip's other organisation, the World Wildlife Fund, Greenpeace, Get Up, Environment Victoria, Climate Institute, Climate Action Network, and the Australian Youth Climate Coalition, and the Australian Council of Trade Unions. Now, of all those groups, the main organising force is this outfit called Get Up. Now, Get Up has become a big influence in Australian politics in recent years. Its stock in trade is to create the impression that it is a grassroots, broad-based Australian political movement, when it is, in fact, the opposite. It is the political battering ram for one of the most sinister people in the world, George Soros, the billionaire mega speculator. Now, we've put out a press release about this week, which you can see the details of. But before we go into some of those details, I just want to highlight the fact that of all those groups, two of the others, the ACF and the World Wildlife Fund, are creations of Prince Philip. And so, Craig, what's relevant here is, isn't it true that both of these men, Soros and Prince Philip, have Nazi backgrounds?
Anyone that's familiar with history and digs a bit deeper than the shallow history given to people over the television usually will find that, yeah, this is true. George Soros himself, for example, has happily and willfully admitted that he was a willing participant in the Holocaust, particularly in Hungary, right under the famous Adolf Eichmann, for example. In at least two interviews that we know of, 1994 and 1998, Soros freely admitted to his Nazi collaboration. So it's no secret. And he
just on that, people say to us, oh, well, hang on, he was a 14-year-old boy. You've got to make allowances for him. But isn't the real issue that when he was pressed on this, the point that he very strongly made is that even as an old man, he feels no remorse for what he did?
Absolutely, and he said in a quote in his autobiography, it was actually probably the happiest year of my life, that year of German occupation. For me, it was a very positive experience. And he looks back at today at being a character-forming part of his personality. Now, the other person, if you can call him that, of note, Prince Philip, look, he's from German background, right? His whole family were part of the Nazi apparatus in many cases, high-ranking Nazis, not stormtroopers, but members of the SS and so forth, right? And this is all covered in the documentary called Unlawful Killing, the film that's just come out recently. So what it goes through is the fact that Philip, yeah, he went to a Nazi school. He was indoctrinated by Nazi teachings. His closest relatives were Nazis. And what people don't really realise is just how much the world, particularly the British, endorsed the Nazis. I mean, for example, the City of London and even George Herbert Hoover Bush, George Bush's grandfather, funded Hitler into power. That's quite well known. Here in Australia, we had Nazi movements like the New Guard that was fighting against Jack Lang, for example. And we go through that in some detail in our New Citizen newspaper called Defeat the Syndicate, Fight for a National Bank, which I encourage all watchers and listeners to get a copy of.
Yeah, and that's available on our website. So we'll have to take another break now, after which finally we'll discuss how the CEC has forced the food bowl exterminators into retreat, but the war is not yet won. Welcome back to the CEC Report again. Finally, for this week, the CEC forces the food bowl exterminators into retreat, but the war is not won. So there is evidence that the drive to smash the Murray-Darling Basin as a food bowl has hit some serious roadblocks. In the last few weeks, you've had a situation where the Wentworth group of quack scientists have quit the Murray-Darling Basin Authority, their role in the Murray-Darling Basin Authority, which although that role was denied vociferously by the Murray-Darling Basin Authority itself in public meetings, they did have a role all along, and they've quit that in protest at the fact that the MDBA, they say, is going a bit weak on water targets to be taken off farmers for the environment. Also yesterday, a lot of publicity was given to the fact that Tony Windsor's committee has handed down its report, which was pretty critical of the Murray-Darling Basin Authority, the way it handled the whole reform process and its sort of lack of caring of the impact on the communities, etc. And this Windsor's report has asked for the water buybacks to be suspended. So that's positive as far as it goes. It is obvious that both these events have been caused by the enormous public backlash in the basin against this whole plan. And of course that backlash has been led by the CEC, because it's the CEC that has supplied the analysis about who was driving this and why. That this was an agenda for genocide, depopulation, and the people whose stated intention was that was led from the British Crown on down. And that has been an explosive analysis distributed all across the basin. Also, the CEC repeatedly testified in front of Tony Windsor's committee to that effect, from Albury to Goondiwindi to Tamworth, all across the basin. We were testifying on that. So you've seen this kind of retreat. However, it can only be seen as a tactical retreat, because the reality is, Craig, the people who hatched this plan are determined to achieve it, and so that means this fight is far from over, isn't it?
Yeah, Robbie, look, what you said before about depopulation, that's the issue. This is not just about shutting down farmland, but this is about depopulating, getting rid of the world's population. And that's what Prince Philip has made very clear, where he says he wants to reduce the world's population down to 2 billion. There's various reports that have come out, like the WGBU report, where the Schellenhuber, he wants the population to go down well below 1 billion people. So there's this big push for population reduction. And that's what the carbon tax is about as well. Here in Australia, you have to ask the question, do we really want farmers? Is there a policy to support farmers across the entirety of Australia, not just in the Murray-Darling Basin? And the answer is, no, there's not. Look, since 1976, we've lost 100 million hectares, 100 million hectares of land that used to be in farming ventures, right? That's basically, in 1976, we had 65% of our land mass involved in farming. That's now down to 52%, right? So there's been a depopulation, as we've said, of the rural areas. You've seen an increase in corporatised farming and a decrease of family farming. Basically, the intention, and that's what's most important here, the intention of the Australian government is to get rid of family farmers, to shut down family farming. And that's what you see in the Murray-Darling Basin, where it's not just the water allocation to the problem, it's the banking system behind the whole Murray-Darling Basin shutdown. And things like the CEC Report that we've actually widely disseminated ourselves, where it was somewhat hidden through our mobilisations as a political movement, whereby you have these clauses in there, material adverse events, I think they're called, MAE clauses, where it was determined before the reports even come out, right, that a reduction in water allocations would trigger these clauses, which means that the banks would stop lending to entire towns, in effect. And this is already taking place in various parts around the Murray-Darling Basin. So the purpose of this is depopulation. The policy is depopulation. And I think people can only fully understand the extent of this policy by getting involved with us, reading our publications, and bringing themselves up to speed on what the actual fight is here. It's the same fight with the carbon tax. It's the same reason why they've gone to so much hysteria trying to push this down people's throats.
Well, the carbon tax is a case in point, because even if, for argument's sake, this whole Murray-Darling Basin Authority plan was scrapped entirely, if they go ahead with the carbon tax, as we've exposed, the Murray-Darling Basin will be turned into a tree plantation anyway.
Yeah.
So the food production capability of Australia will be shot.
If there's a tax on agricultural production, which is what they're intending, it means that the cost of production rises even more than what it has in the last 20 years. Therefore, farmers are going to say, well, why should I produce anything? I'll just put trees in. They'll put trees in, or they get taken over by management investment funds, as happened before, and you end up destroying the productive land and putting just simply trees over the top.
Yep. All right, well, that's it for this week's CEC Report. Stay tuned for more updates in future weeks, and as usual, the things that we've covered you can find on our website. And I urge you, like I said at the beginning, watch if you haven't already read it, get yourself What Australia Must Do to Survive the Depression. Get involved with us. The best way to do it is send us an email or call us, 1-800-636-432. We are having an enormous impact, but we're building a mass movement because we're not just here to have an impact, we're here to win this. So see you next week.